Welcome, America, and those listening in from overseas to the fourth in a four-part series sponsored by the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. And we are having a series on the manufacturing base for the future of artificial intelligence, particularly relates to national security. And so we want to welcome those who are listening in. I am Lucian Niemeyer, and I am not going to be the moderator. I'm going to be the herder because we have two incredible guests today that on their own are going to be able to take us in a lot of different directions. So the goal is to come out at the end of the webinar with some fantastic ideas. You'll hear some crazy riffs, but the goal is to start thinking about how do we look at the supply chain for AI and from a manufacturing base. And so we're talking about AI factories. And more importantly is how do we make sure that that supply chain ultimately is secured all the way to the front? So we're going to actually have a couple of guests talk about AI from the base all the way to the front. So looking forward to that. Lucian Niemeyer again. My background, I'm a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, former Senate staffer, former Air Force officer. So I've been all over the place, former White House official. I've got more formers than some folks have ex-wives. But I'm really looking forward to being able to share the stage with a couple of true experts. General Vaughn, great to see you. You're looking fantastic. And then also Ron Nussle. So what I would like to do is Ron, I'll set the stage for a couple minutes, and I'll turn it over to you for an introduction, and I'll turn over an introduction for Major General Vaughn. And my gosh, thank God we've got Jen who just joined us in too. So Jen, I don't know if you want to say anything more. I did kick us off, but is there anything more you
I
want to say?
heard you kicking us off, and I didn't want to interrupt just as you were about to introduce the speakers. So, thanks everyone for being here. I think, Lucian, you did a much better introduction than I would have done. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to the three experts that we have today
Yeah.
to talk through the challenges.
Yep. So I just want to make sure for those of you who are for the first time listening in, there are other interviews that we've done over the last 4 months. The second and third parts of this series will be available as a link on YouTube, and then we'll put this one on YouTube as well. But we've talked about the power concerns we have as a nation. We've talked about what AI can be used for in the realm of digital twins. We had some incredible guests talking about the ability of AI really to change the battle space. And we're going to continue that conversation today, but more importantly, get a little more details and some new insight into ultimately how do we actually secure AI. So what I would like to do is, first of all, making sure you have a chance to check out the other webinar series, but I would like to open it up with Mr. Ron Nussle. If you could just spend a couple minutes introducing yourself, then we'll do General Vaughn, and then I know you've convinced us. We have never done slides before for this webinar series. You've convinced us.
I begged you and I bribed you and did a whole bunch of other stuff to get you to let me show some PowerPoints. So
Yeah,
thank
well,
you.
more importantly, you're coming to us live from the mountains of Utah.
Yeah,
So we'll let you throw a couple slides up there, but I promise you the rest of the webinar will be us just talking about what we think we need to move forward. So just a couple minutes on your intro, Ron, then General Vaughn, and then we'll hit your slides.
sure. Thanks. So I spent 2 years in the State Department. So I only have one former in terms of U.S. government
Yeah.
service, although I did go to the Air Force Academy. So I guess that's another former. During COVID, and I was put in charge of the semiconductor supply chain resilience. We studied the entire global semiconductor supply chain. I am a C-level executive from the semiconductor industry. I've both built semiconductor fabs, and I've also been a C-level supply chain executive building semiconductor equipment. And then I spent about 25 years before that in the aerospace and defense industry, designing jet engines and being in charge of supply chain there as well. So that's my background.
All right, and then we are honored to have someone that's actually still on active duty. I lovingly call him Hertz, as does the rest of the world, only because he's full of wattage, full of power. But General Vaughn, if you want to introduce yourself real quickly, and you have more titles than I can ever imagine. So let us know what your role you're serving right now, and then we'll get back to Ron here for an opening.
We don't need to go into all the titles, but I will say I'm a W suite executive for warfighting. And so going all the way back, started as a fighter pilot, been flying ski planes in the North and South Pole. Most of my career is operational, deployed everywhere you can imagine, all seven continents and beyond. So Right now, I work in the Undersecretary's office, acquisition and sustainment, several hats in there. But what we're working on is accelerating munitions production in the defense industrial base. We're also, as kind of related to that, but a separate effort, is to provide rapid acquisition for warfighter needs. Right now, what they need today on the battlefield that maybe is lagging in the supply chain to get there. And then finally, we're doing acquisition integration and interoperability. And so what your topic today with artificial intelligence and supply chain and how this all relates hits home with everything we're doing, all those hats I'm wearing. Over.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what we're going to have a discussion today about a new type of munition that we need to be tracking, that readiness. I'm looking forward to that discussion, Hertz, with you. Okay, Ron, you have some compelling slides that let us know what we're up against vis-a-vis our adversaries when it comes to AI. Why don't you take it over there and run through a few opening remarks of what you see in reality that's happening around the world and what we're up against?
Yeah, so this is it's only 3 or 4 slides. Again, I appreciate you, Lucian, letting me show these. I
Yeah, no
presented
worries. It's the last webinar, so.
I presented these in about 2 years ago, and it's actually taken from some of the analysis that I did when a threat assessment when I was at the State Department during COVID, and I was in charge of doing this for the entire global semiconductor ecosystem. So I only want to show you 3 quick slides. I presented this to about 300 or 400 CEOs of a semiconductor industry in January of 2024 at a conference. So just to kind of set the table, again, I've run managed global supply chains multiple times for Fortune 500 companies, so I know what it's like to manage a multi-billion-dollar supply chain. But just quickly, this is a semiconductor supply chain for dummies, so to speak. If you were to break the entire global semiconductor supply chain into 5 segments, you'd say it starts with design, then fabs, and then ATP, assembly, test, and packaging. And underlying all of it are materials and equipment. And I'm just going to talk about just one aspect of the materials side. Again, we could talk about this. I could literally talk about this for days and days straight. But when you're done with all that, then it goes into a server. And then I was chief operating officer for a company that built semiconductor fabs, built global foundries in Albany, New York, the company that I worked for. So I understand the construction side. I also understand the equipment side. But I just want to talk to you just about one aspect, just to show you what we're up against from a threat assessment standpoint. I'm just going to talk about polysilicon, which is basically the foundation of the AI and semiconductor supply chain. I prefer to use the term value chain, but its supply chain is kind of what everyone else calls it. But if you just look at global polysilicon semiconductors, in 2004, from 2023, the U.S., the largest company in the world, was Hemlock Semi in Michigan. Now, in 2023, these slides are a couple years old, they increased by 5x. Hey, that's fantastic. They increased their output by 5x. But what did China do during that same time frame? They increased by 100x during that same time frame. And it wasn't just, again, I came from the commercial side. It wasn't just better quality, better cost, better delivery, better service. It was actually through targeted actions. I'm just going to give you one specific example of some of those targeted actions. In 2020, the 2 largest China polysilicon manufacturers had quote unquote fires, and people were hurt. We don't know because, again, a lot of information doesn't come out. But during that time, 10 to 15% of the global polysilicon market share was taken off, and prices skyrocketed 20%. Hemlock Semiconductor, and this is based on some conversations with their C-suite, during that same time frame, they had been applied with 57% tariffs, everything they shipped going into China, going back to 2014. It was renewed in 2020, renewed again in January of 2026. So 57% tariffs. Even during a worldwide shortage caused by these fires, they weren't able to ship anything into China. So the result was no exports. So it just shows you what's going on with the threat assessment. So as a result of that, the market share of China's polysilicon has skyrocketed. And then on the bottom, you can see a picture of the solar piece of that. Polysilicon is used both in solar panels as the raw material for solar panels, as well as in semiconductors. This just shows you how China basically controls the world's polysilicon supply chain. Again, not just through better cost or better quality or through government subsidies, but through specific targeted actions against foreign entities. And as a result of that, just kind of key takeaways. 57% tariffs have been continued unabated. They've been renewed twice in 2020 and again this year in 2026. They've cut our exports by 90% plus. It uses incredible amounts of energy, and that's what I want to talk about next. And there's only 3 polysilicon entities left in the United States, and 2 of them are on life support. So I'm going to talk about just one of these companies, and then I'll get off the stage. One of these Chinese polysilicon companies. If you heard Secretary Pompeo, who I've happened to have the privilege of working for and knowing for almost 25 years, he talks about the Xinjiang province, the Uyghurs, otherwise known as slave labor. So these plants that China has built are all in the Xinjiang province. Why? Because they use incredible amounts of energy, as much energy as an entire city, which we're now finding is the same story with the AI server farms, using as much energy as a city. So they built dedicated coal-fired power plants right next door, and you can see them. The polysilicon plant went up, and the coal-fired power plant went up. And these are Google Earth screenshots. So this isn't some sort of national security information. You can get this off of Google Earth. And so this company increased by 100x from 1,500 tons per year to 150,000 tons per year, primarily because they've got this access to this incredibly cheap energy. But the story gets even deeper than that. So here's the Xinjiang province, and you can see that the polysilicon plant is located less than 100 kilometers away from coal-fired power plant or coal mines. These coal mines are bigger than anything almost in the entire world, certainly bigger than anything in the United States. The picture is here in Utah. The largest open pit mine in the United States is here in Utah. But these are much bigger than that. They're massive. And then if you look on Google Earth, you can see a line, if you can see my cursor, a mile or kilometer long of semi trucks filled with coal lined up, waiting and idling and dumping coal into this coal-fired power plant. And if you've ever been to China, and I've been there 25 times, there's no emissions on these trucks. They're pumping out gas or pumping out smoke. So this is what we're up against. So to summarize, economic and national security, PRC has a 20-year national strategy to incentivize every single segment. They have tariff moats specifically targeted Western firms. Their energy policy is 100% aligned with their production policy, and their lack of regulatory and sustainability burdens that we don't have to deal with, no OSHA or EPA, and dirty coal-fired production. Meanwhile, in the West, just in the last year or so, 30 U.S. states have passed regulations targeting new server farm production. Energy policy for our recent decades has been shutting down existing energy facilities and prohibiting new construction of either clean coal or nuclear. And finally, U.S. companies have been offshoring almost every segment of the semiconductor value chain. So that's kind of the table setting for what we're fighting against from an adversarial standpoint. Over to you.
Yeah,
Ron,
absolutely. I don't know,
pinning it.
General Vaughn, if you have anything to add or respond to that. I'm blown away because this is exactly what we're faced with right now. We are in an arms race, and I'm not sure we're keeping up. General Vaughn, I don't know your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think it's a great point Ron made. And this is something I think we need to do a better job. Those people who have this information, have been briefed, are aware of it, and see the threat, need to get this information out there. We talked a little bit about civil defense in a prior conversation. This country used to really have a very solid, strong civil defense. Every citizen in the country knew where the enemy was, they knew where the threats were, and everybody kind of knew their part. Certainly World War II, pitching in, whether you're buying bonds or working in a factory. But even during the Cold War, we had spotters, we had people that understood that the threat is all around us. Right now, I think that there's a disconnect between those people in national security that understand some of the points that Ron just made, and then the broader picture that China's intent is not necessarily good, and then the general public, who not only may not be connected to this discussion, but they're also being very intentionally and actively fed misinformation, false information, and information that runs counter to the facts in this case. So I think the information, getting this out here, exactly what you're talking about, Ron, and taking this on the road, making a road show out of it, publishing op-eds just to get the information out, I think that's an excellent start, and we need to do more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, one of the things that's coming out of this webinar series, and Jen knows this better than anybody, is that we're going to be publishing some op-eds and some thought pieces on, okay, how do we actually solve this situation? Ron, you brought up a fantastic point right now, and rightfully so. There are communities around the country who are concerned that the proliferation of what you call server farms, we call them data centers or AI factories, is creating risk for other private development around the country. And you're right. Maine, the state of Maine just passed a 3-year moratorium on data center construction just in the last couple of weeks. And in some cases for valid reasons. Electricity is going up. I would not necessarily blame it on proliferation of AI data centers. I'd blame it on what you just put down there as your second bullet, that we've had a premature retirement of other forms of generation that's created a flatness in our supply at a time when we need an explosive demand, or we have explosive demand. So we're seeing that disconnect. So there's a lot to unpack here. The question is, okay, how do we move on solutions knowing this reality? I don't see us, Ron, trying to, as much as taking this out there. I'm not sure we're going to convince Joe Bag of Donuts, living next to a data center somewhere in Northern Virginia, hey, we need to keep building these things, even though your view shed goes away because it's good for national security. So we've got to come up with other mechanisms, I think, to be able to address the compelling national need for a power emergency. And we talked about that power emergency 2 webinars ago, but we need to do it in a way that maybe we need to start looking at what the Chinese are doing, which is co-location of power generation, and these capabilities, not just the manufacturing capability, but once we have the data center, we're manufacturing tokens that we need to secure the token supply chain. And that's something that I think is amazing. You take all these physical materials, you put them all together, you create a GPU and a support mechanism, and out pops a token that becomes the currency that ultimately we apply then to AI. And so now the question is, how do we secure that entire supply chain? What a great way to start us off. Now let's talk about potentially a solution. What can we do? Hertz, you and I have been all over the place on LinkedIn talking about securing a manufacturing base. First of all, talk to us about how you look at the world of tokens, which is truly everything that Ron talked about, all the raw materials, all that energy going in, creating that inflection point where someone makes a query in AI and out pops a reasoning. Talk to us a little bit about how you're looking at that within DoW as a token management.
Yeah, you can see this evolving on the battlefield in Ukraine right now, especially with the FPV drivers, the first-person visual drone drivers that are out on the front line. We get little bits and pieces of the reports in the open media, but when we do a little deeper dive and actually talk to these Ukrainian pilots coming back, what they desperately need is access to personal compute. So every soldier needs compute the way soldiers also need bullets. And so if you think of tokens is the way we meter and allocate and distribute compute, across an enterprise. Think of tokens like bullets. Tokens are like ammo. And as the fight continues in AI, we're in an AI arms race right now. A lot of folks aren't aware of that. They reject the notion of it. The problem with losing an AI arms race is if you do lose and you get too far behind, it's insurmountable and you can't catch up and it's game over for us. And so it's really important for us to understand right now that our frontline soldiers, and that's actual soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Guardians, as well as people working in the private sector in our supply chain, as well as our public security, public law enforcement, people like that. Those folks are going to need access to compute at an unprecedented scale. Right now, the way we distribute compute, it's almost a peanut butter spread in a lot of organizations. And so a company may go out and actually acquire access to compute. They may have a data center with the right energy. They may have a robust system set up. But what they don't have is the layer on top that lets those folks that need access to compute right now to be successful get the compute they need. And some examples that we're seeing, and I'll talk about the Ukrainians so we don't divulge anything we're doing here in the building, but folks in the front line will run into token stops or limits, and they aren't able to continue processing. And this is especially true if you have one soldier trying to fly maybe 10 drones at once. We're going to have to absolutely get into that mindset. And eventually you're going to have to pull the human out of the loop on that. And you can only do that if you have access to the right amount of compute.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Ron, as you've studied the supply chain and then ultimately why we need to secure the supply chain just to the missions that General Vaughn that talked about, have you given any thought to what does our course of our country? Where do we need to, aside from raising awareness on the public, on the national security essentiality and economic essentiality? Have you given any thought what more can we do from a public policy perspective to ultimately get past some of the issues you identified on your slide towards a more positive and productive securing in the manufacturing base? I just wanted to open up to you for any ideas. I know I've got a few, and I know definitely Hertz has a few, but just wanted to offer your perspective first.
Well, I haven't heard that expression before. Joe, I think you said Joe's six pack of donuts or something like that. That
Yeah,
was
Joe
maybe a
bag of donuts.
mixed metaphor of six packs and donuts together. Sounds like a great. I think isn't that called Breakfast of Champions? Six pack and a bag of donuts. Um,
Oh,
the
gross.
acronym is NIMBY, not in my backyard. Everybody wants more compute, but not in my backyard. Everybody wants more power, but they don't want the coal-fired power plant next door to them. I lived in Arizona for 25 years, and one of the last major nuclear power plant in the United States was built like, I don't know, 1,000 miles away from downtown Phoenix or something. It's way the heck out there at Palo Verde nuclear power plant. My roommate actually worked there. He had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and take a bus to get out there. So nobody wants it in their backyard. The challenge then is, well, what do you have to do? And then General Vaughn, you're far more of an expert on this. We have things like the War Powers Act. When we do have national security issues, and clearly this is a national security issues, we have to break down some of the local turf battles that exist between, whoever it is, the PTA or the local, organization, because these are national security issues. So we have to, unfortunately, use a little bit of the stick. And having been to China many times, I actually got to go visit the Three Gorges Dam when I was there. I can promise you there was no public comment or policy when they evicted hundreds of thousands of villagers to make way for that dam. They just said, get the F out of here. And they picked them up and moved them. Now, we're not going to go there because then we're no longer America. We're just China. So we're not going to go that far, but we have to have some sort of a blended situation between, whatever, anybody that with a sticker that they can stand up and put on their bumper can stop a multi-billion-dollar facility, to the government can just come in and exert eminent domain and kick hundreds or thousands of people out. There has to be some sort of a blended compromise.
Yeah, and that's exactly what General Vaughn and I have been talking about for the last few months, but we've been looking at for now for years is we need to move towards securing a organic AI manufacturing base for essential AI. In other words, don't necessarily rely on that private developer who's building on private land using grid power. We have to start doing what you just proposed, or you illustrated, Ron, is we got to start building our own power generation on federal land and potentially building our data center that we need for national security AI for in a way that General Vaughn laid out. We need to build it organically. And how fast can we get that done? I mean, that's where I've been hoping we would take the entire four-part series is to really convince folks who are listening in. It's time to look at a national security enterprise of dedicated AI factories that have a reliable power source, that have reliable supply chain, then ultimately can provide that reliable AI, which is what Hertz laid out all the way to the front. Jenna Vaughn, I know
Yeah.
we've been talking around the edges on that. I mean, I know there's a way to do that with private sector financing. Is that something that we're starting to see in the building that we definitely need to have this organic manufacturing base?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. Let me start with a couple of background items that are of concern. And again, this is some of the research our team has done as we've tried to help accelerate munitions production. We're estimating there's probably about 700 of these massive data centers in the United States right now, either in operation or under rapid development, so they're kind of pending. To be competitive through 2030, we're going to need about 33% more per year between now and then. So 200 to 300 more of these. And you can imagine these are massive infrastructure projects that are going on. The first step in this, in my opinion, and you hit on it, Lucian, is these need to be declared as critical national infrastructure. Now, the difference between this and when we were doing nuclear weapons development during the Cold War these also have a very strong commercial value, and that's part of our nation's strength. So part of our national security is our strong economy. And so there's actually two good reasons to declare this critical national security. The other part of it is when you look at deployment of capital, and that is one of the things we've really gotten into. We have the Economic Defense Unit here in the Pentagon now that recently stood up. They're looking at how do we get with the entire supply chain, not just the large defense contractor primes, but all the way down the chain, all the way into rare earth elements and to the energy side, into the raw materials. How do we make that more resilient? How do we onshore, or some people talk about friendshoring with allies, and get the adversary out of our supply chain? And I really appreciate Ron's discussion of ATP, assembly, test, and packaging, because even if and a lot of folks think, well, the CHIPS Act, we're going to onshore semiconductors, and that's an important step. But if you have to, every chip that you make, every piece of the foundry work, you have to ship it back to an adversary then for the ATP part of the process, you're going to be losing again. Also, when you talk about somebody, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in. Hi, as part of trying to add context to this, right? This is not the semiconductor issue, and being able to build out that capability for not just national security purposes, and to be able to trust those chips coming out and access to them. But also I appreciate your conversation on economic security, right? Where we've got to be able to secure those chips, have access to those chips for the companies here in the United States. If we can do that, we'll solve part of the problem for defense. And you're able then to deploy additional capital where you see those returns. And that is one of the few remaining sectors that has such a high return because it is such large volume. So sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to just
Oh, no worries.
to build on it here as part of so much of the work that we've done here at the Institute to support both Ron and some of the work that he presented, and General Vaughn to the work that you're talking about of all of those pieces of our 30 years have been building to the conversation that we're having today. So back to you.
Yeah.
No, and what you hit on is really important, because there has been, and we're even seeing it now, weaponization of Western capital. And, I love the charts that compare the defense spending of each country, because when you look at a country like People's Republic of China, their defense spending hits every category. So if they're spending on infrastructure, that's defense. If they're spending on commerce, that's defense. If they're spending on jobs, that's also defense, because the veil that's over the way they allocate their capital from the government. And then so you may have a commercial venture that's very attractive, from a profit standpoint, from an ROI standpoint for our Western investors. We'll invest in that thinking there's no connection to the military or to the Chinese government, when in fact it's directly funding some of those projects. So that's why I talk about, and that's intentional, by the way. That's intentional by the adversary. And so that weaponization of Western capital. One other piece in that, and we talked about the NIMBY, not in my backyard. I don't know if you're familiar, the House Committee on Natural Resources and House Committee on Oversight and Accountability have these very deep probes into what's called dark money that's infiltrating our U.S. environmental nonprofits. So you have local groups that are concerned about the noise and the pollution from gas turbines, very well intended, right? And who doesn't want to be concerned and maybe put some mitigation onto that? But they will end up getting funding directly from our adversaries unless we declare this critical national infrastructure, in which case we then have the teeth and the ability to go in and see where this money's coming from and reveal it.
Yep. No, I've been studying that. As you know, I used to run environmental programs for the Department of Defense, and you're right. There's a very active litigation lobby and litigation practice nationwide to stymie and stifle some of the major development projects we have for our country. And those are funded by some folks that, you wonder sometimes, why they want to take that kind of funding for this type of activity. I want to pick up on a point real quick, General Vaughn, that you mentioned as far as critical infrastructure. I look at it, the combination of a power plant, whether it be a coal plant, gas plant, nuclear power plant, when you co-locate it, like Ron pointed out in his slides, with a data center, I'm looking at that as a weapon system. Because you're looking at, it's no different from an F-35 or an aircraft carrier. You have a power plant and you have a platform for which you're deploying a military capability. I think once we start talking about the combination of high performance compute with a power plant and they need to be treated more like a weapon system. I think that starts pointing to the model that I think Ron wants us to get to, which is we need to start stationing this infrastructure in locations that are not opposed by local communities so we can ultimately have access to that deployable AI, which is what you brought up early in the conversation about why the warfighter needs a secure supply chain from the factory all the way to the front. And how we deploy that AI through a computer, through a drone, through a robot, that supply chain needs to be secure. So I think that there's something here that coming out of this series that we need to start talking about the fact that not all AI factories are created equal. There's a lot of private sector development for AI for peaceful means. I look forward to AI being able to solve cancer someday, to help us out with engineering, to do amazing societal things. But I also want AI that has an organic base to make us the strongest nation on earth so we never get attacked again. So that's kind of what I think we need to start talking about coming out of this series is treating it like a weapon system, treating that secure delivery of AI as an essential capability to include the readiness of that AI. Talk to us a little bit about that. I know, Hertz, you've been starting to talk about readiness, token and AI readiness. Some thoughts there you want to share with the group?
Yeah, and I'm interested to hear from Ron on the infrastructure piece. One of the things we need to look at, and this is a hard pill to swallow for some. A lot of folks think they understand what AI is, and I'm also a novice compared to the real geniuses on this thing. But AI is not just cloud. It's not just in the ether. AI is physical. It's concrete. It's foundations. It's steel. It's rare earth elements, heavy and light. It's magnets, and it's gigawatts and gigawatts of power. And if we start to think of it that way, and then juxtapose that with what you talked about as a weapon system, then we start to really see the picture of where we need to secure the supply chain. Those of us working in munitions acceleration think of supply chain as the parts and pieces that go into making maybe a missile. If you look at the operations that occur, even extracting minerals from the ground and processing it, those machines are very high tech. They're laden with a lot of semiconductors, and most of them are made in China. And so as that goes through the process, and you talk about kill switches, and we've seen all these stories from Europe about certain things there's an embedded kill switch. That supply chain and that security and being able to ensure that the warfighter has not only access to compute, but that the model is trained, that all the layers that give him the right data at the time of relevance, all of that is correct. So you've got the supply chain on the hardware side, supply chain on the software side, and then you have the supply chain on the data side. And a lot of folks don't even want to talk about that in the different layers that go into there. So we've got 3 or 4 angles or elements or perspectives on how to address the supply chain to get it right to the warfighter at that time of need. And if any one of those is interrupted or threatened, then you're going to lose. You're going to lose in combat, and you're going to lose a war.
Yep. Hey, Ron, I want to give you a chance to chime in here. I know we've been going back and forth. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to pick up on something General Vaughn said just a few minutes ago. I think I'm in a somewhat unique position to opine on this because I've been both on the government side. I've been part of the DoD supply chain as a sub-tier supplier to the Big Five, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, et cetera. I've also been on the commercial side. And the reality is, and if you do what there's a supply chain. I'm going to give you a buzzword: bomb explosion. Not the kind of bomb you're thinking of, a kinetic bomb, but a BOM, bill of materials. Exactly. When you do a bill of materials explosion, you couldn't do that anymore. You can't even do it manually anymore because some of these bombs go down 20, 30, and 40 levels when you start trying to do them. So now there's software that like Exeger, et cetera, that you can actually do those multi-layered bombs. But when you start digging into those, and you have to point out the fact that when we start talking about the military term is dual use, the reality is when you go to the Big Five, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, GD, et cetera, I don't know what the percentages are these days, 60 to 80% government procurement. You go down one level, now you're talking 10%. You go down 2 levels, you're talking single-digit percents. Once you start going down 3 or 4 levels, the amount of spend that the government has as part of that supply chain is fractions of a percent. So the kind of the old tool set that the DoD used to use with used to be called DCAS, forgot what the new acronym for that is, managing all the audits and all the security analysis that have to be required. The overhead to that, unless you're 10, 20, 30% DoD spend, the cost benefit analysis doesn't make sense. So to use some of those old tools don't really work on the commercial side. So having been on the commercial side, I can tell you that there are companies that didn't want to get into the defense because they were so afraid of this heavy-handed, overburdensome mentality that's kind of guided our typical forces. So anyway, so it is a real challenge to start thinking about these commercial things that are 3 or 4 levels down in the bill of materials because there are 90 to 95 to 99% commercial. So how do we secure those from a national security standpoint without the heavy-handed bureaucracy that's traditionally existed in a lot of government procurement programs?
Hey, I've got a question because I think the three of you are sitting in this really unique space, and I think that having each of you respond will be really insightful for the audience. But to the any of these industrial policy issues that we've talked about, but I'm going to focus on AI from the manufacturing base for the question. Who should own the responsibility across the federal government for this to be part of national infrastructure? And I ask the question because you look at the CHIPS Act, which went to Department of Commerce. There's a known need from energy and defense. You think about energy and you look at the Genesis mission, and that's coming out of the Department of Energy. And you look at some of the ways that have been already proposed during this session and previous about using military bases to have that type of infrastructure, which would imply that defense would own it. And so as you look across everything that's going on, and Ron, the supply chain analysis you did came out of State Department, right? And so
Right.
when you look across the federal government, it doesn't seem like there's a really great place for somebody to own these types of issues. And if you could each comment relatively quickly, I think it would be helpful to, Lucian, to your point of trying to get to answers.
I can go first if you all don't. While you're gathering your thoughts. All right. So Jen, you just set me up in an amazing way. We need an AI
Sorry,
program
everyone.
management office. We need a PMO. So we need to treat AI and data centers, the infrastructure, same way we treat the F-35, same way we're putting billions of dollars into the submarine industrial base. We need to start asking ourselves actively a separate program of record for creating a program management office joint across the services for the physical infrastructure, the weapon system of AI. That it would include, doing exactly what Ron suggested. We do track the supply chain in an F-35. We know where we have potential foreign source vulnerabilities down to the magnets, down to individual magnets in an F-35. We need to be able to do the same thing for the AI factory we're going to rely on for AI. So I think it would be a very smart thing for the Department of War, not just within CDAO, but within ANS, of actually standing up or having a service to stand up a PMO, a joint PMO, and we start actually actively addressing the secure manufacturing of AI. And that's, the F-35 PMO goes out to Fort Worth every other month, and works on, what is needed to keep that supply line going. We need to do the same thing. Start treating it as a weapon system, try to treat it as an essential weapon system, and start putting resources into doing securing the supply chain, like Ron mentioned, but more importantly, ensuring that F-35 will deliver the KPIs, which is what General Vaughn's been working on, and having one office manage that supply chain and the delivery of those key performance indicators.
All right, I got one vote for DOD. One vote for DOD. General
Yeah.
Vaughn, up to you.
Yeah, so I definitely see the merit there. So if you look at what DoD has on their plate right now and the types of things we're getting into, especially our economic warfare unit, economic defense unit, EDU, kind of models what Potomac Institute's been talking about. But economics is an operational domain. And so if we try to address the security of the supply chain and the bomb explosion, so I spent 10 years as a manufacturing engineer in the
Oh,
private sector before active duty.
okay. I
And
didn't
so,
know that. That's great. So you know
yeah,
what it is.
so merging bombs from two different subcontractors that use different numbering
Yeah.
and computer systems was always the bane of our existence in the bomb explosion. But if we look at economics as an operational domain, there's a case to be made to at least use caution if DOW has the lead, because the economic side of this, if DOW does what sometimes it's done in the past and slows things down, you're going to have a huge economic consequence that won't be immediately apparent in our readiness numbers necessarily. And so I think there's some collaboration with who cares deeply about making sure that our free market is super successful and not overregulated, balancing that with how do we ensure resilience and security in the supply chain so we can go forward with offense.
Yeah, I mean, let me caveat that the airline industry produces a ton of aircraft. I'm talking about the F-35. So in other words, create for that military security AI, what we're going to need, setting up that, not necessarily trying to apply it to the entire AI factory base in the country. Ron, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to give you a chance there.
No, 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 that's fine. So Jen's heard me say this before, so she already knows what I'm gonna. So I have a moonshot idea, and it's we've presented this before. We actually met with a half a dozen senators about a year and a half ago, as and part of my part-time role on the Kroc Institute as Commissioner of Critical Supply Chains. But I have a moonshot idea. I actually believe we're in 2001 all over again. What happened in 2001 after 9/11? The U.S. government decided that Homeland Security was fragmented among 15 different or 20 different, or however many different entities within the U.S. government. Maybe it was executed well, maybe it was executed poorly. I'm not going to comment on that. But we created the Department of Homeland Security, and we took the Coast Guard, and we took, all these different agencies, and we brought them together, and we created a cabinet level position. I actually believe that we need a cabinet level position in charge of national supply chain. That's how important and that's how critical it is. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of infighting if that were to happen. But General, you even talked about it. Commerce from a commercial side, Department of War from a military side, Department of Energy. But it goes even beyond that. We've got natural resources through all these things with the issues that we have to deal with the rare earth minerals. And putting together, and how do you put together a lithium mine without having 500 protesters show up in the middle of the desert somewhere where nobody even lives and say, no, you can't do that because this is some sort of special ground. So almost every single U.S. government entity has got critical supply chain issues. I actually think that it needs to be a cabinet level position. I know that's a big ask, but it's a moonshot idea. And Elon Musk is the kind of guy that puts those moonshot ideas together. Who would have ever thought of putting a gigawatt server farm out in space? Well, those are the kind of solutions we have to think about, because the energy is almost limitless when you put solar, and you don't have all the heat issues because it's it's at nearly absolute zero. So anyway, these are the kind of big ideas that I think we need to deal with this issue.
How do we do, Jen, with your question?
I love it. I got three different perspectives from all of your somewhat interrelated backgrounds coming at it from and I see justification in each of them. Not that you just didn't give it, but that we've heard similar types of arguments when we talked about semiconductors, when we've talked about some of the genetics and the health information, right? Who's supposed to own this at what level for what purposes? So when you look at these critical infrastructure, industrial policy type questions, it's not an easy answer. And to create something like DHS all over again, which there's lots of ongoing and previous discussion for now 25 years later of DHS, how have we done, right? And are we going to do it better the next time? I think the jury's out. So it is as critical as needing a cabinet position. Absolutely. Is it going to happen? Judges are out.
Yeah, I would go in a little bit of direction. I was not sure I would do national or supply chain infrastructure. I was more thinking you were going to do a Department of Technology. In other words, a cabinet level position that looks at the technology supply chain, looks at the applications for technology, but stands apart from the Department of Energy as the
You could
policy
call
for
it, I
all of
mean,
technology
Jen
growth.
talked about this. You could call it industrial policy if you wanted to get away from some of the issues. The issues with supply chain is that everybody has their own ownership and their own equity in it. So again, we're gonna have a lot of infighting. So, oh, I'm in charge of supply chain, but if you think about this, and again, I'm in a unique position. I've been on the government side, the military supply chain, and the commercial supply chain. We don't like to use the word industrial policy because that feels like central planning. And we all know, General, what happened to the central planning in the USSR, right? Eventually, their 5-year plans just started collapsing. So they started just rewriting the same ones over and over again because it was so disconnected from reality. But here's the issue. The issue is, and I'm a laissez-faire, a free market economist guy and always have been. The reality is we're no longer in a free market economy. We have people in all of these other countries putting their hand on the scale of commerce and making winning and losing decisions. So we're really fighting a very uneven fight. And I just kind of showed you just one small example on the semiconductor side. You've got energy policy, you've got the environmental policy, you've got low cost labor rates, you've got where you're going to build this thing. You've got construction and permitting and the NIMBY issue. All of these different levels of policy are all very heavy-handed. And then on top of that, you've got 57% tariffs being applied so that no competitors can get in while they're building these nascent industries up from 1% to now 90 plus percent. So I think it has to be broad enough to whether you call it a industrial policy or a chief supply chain officer for the United States or something. I'll let the people that are more adept at political intrigue than I am make those decisions. But the mission should still be clear. Identifying the supply chain resilience factors, just like I showed you an example of, putting together risk mitigation plans, and those risk mitigation implementation of those has to be done at a whole of government level. And somebody's got to make some of these decisions, even on things like critical minerals. We couldn't even get alignment between. There's over 150 government entities involved in the critical minerals conversation today. 150. Who makes the final decision? What's the final deciding factor about what the strategy is around critical minerals? Yeah, exactly. Who's got the money? Who's got the budget? Is what Jen's saying. So
Who's going to pay up?
yeah, who's going to pay for it?
Hey, there's one thing that I want to make sure we're coming up, believe it or not, that our hour is flying by. But I want to address one issue that was brought up by General Vaughn earlier in the webinar. He talks about a warfighter at the edge needing to have the AI. So we were talking about the supply chain to go from the mining and the extraction materials to the development of that GPU and that AI factory. Now let's talk the supply chain that leaves that factory or then delivery, that line of communication that goes to the warfighter. General Vaughn, you're starting to write publicly about the idea of AI and token readiness. We brought up what a token is. Can you talk a little bit about what your thoughts are as far as token readiness all the way to the front for the warfighter?
Yeah, and so the way we assess readiness and warfighting, changes over time, but it's generally anchored in the soldier, sailor, airman, marine, guardian, the individual human. Are they physically fit? Are they ready? All these kind of things. Can they deploy? Have they gotten that stuff figured out financially, et cetera? All those elements, that's a readiness piece. The equipment that person has is assessed. And then apart from that, are they trained to use the equipment in that environment? And then even broader is, are they part of a unit that is equipped appropriately and trained, and then the logistics and all that? So there's layers of readiness. What we don't currently calculate, and what I think we need to start integrating right away, is access to compute. So I can tell you when forces deploy anywhere in the world, how much fuel they have, how much fuel is available, how we might get the fuel to them. I can talk about ammunition resupply, constraints, and bottlenecks. I have really no way to talk to you about their access to compute. I can kind of talk about Wi-Fi. That's a
You can
fits and
talk about
starts.
battery life.
You can talk about battery life. And in fact, if you look at it, and I'm intimately involved in purchasing some of the newer weapons, even the newer version of an old weapon will now have some sort of information bearing technology and parts that it didn't previously. And every 30 days, you have to plug it in and recharge it. And so even if you're storing them in warehouses, there are these mythical warehouses full of weapons that everybody talks about. Really, they're distributed because you don't want them too close to each other in case something happens. But now you have to go in and feed them like animals. You have to put some trons into those things to keep those batteries charged. And then you also have to feed the data. And so we don't talk about this a whole lot, but if we're going to be in a high electromagnetic environment like we have in Ukraine right now, you don't want to be beholden to a GPS signal or any RF signal for that matter. And so internal navigation, there's some new magnetic navigation going on. That data is also something you have to refresh. So then stepping back to what Lucian asked, how do we assess that in terms of readiness? And how do we present it in a way that commanders can understand? And more importantly, and from the House of Lords, you'll appreciate this, how Congress can understand it. Congress, I tell you what, maybe second only to the Department of War, Congress deeply cares about readiness of our military. And we need to be able to show this to them and make that case so then we can fund that case.
Yeah, and I think when we start talking about an output of AI, which is a token, and started equating it to a ammunition, it is the ammunition for our drones, for our robots, for our computers that we need to feed AI forward to the warfighter through that token allocation. Now we start to tracking tokens as a unique aspect. General Vaughn, you and I'm former military engineer. I grew up with a table of allowances. I'm a deployable unit. And as you deploy with your unit, and you have connexes full of your table of allowances and stuff you take with you to theater, right? And what you think you need to do your mission, and then ultimately you identify through the tip fid what you're going to need for resupply to maintain your mission. For as you're flying jets, you need an ammunition. That's what you need more than anything else. I think we need to start looking at the units that are going to rely on AI to be effective through their drone, through their robot that's with them, through their computer. What do they need for table allowances, for tokens and AI, and ensuring that those lines of communication are forward? I think that's a measurement of readiness. How ready is that unit trained and ready to deploy that AI at the tactical edge to prevail on the battlefield? I think
Yeah,
that's what we need to get to, that part of the supply chain, not just coming out of the
Lucian,
AI
if
factory,
yeah,
but actually to the deployed edge.
if I can jump in, I think one of the ways of thinking about it too, in terms of readiness, is how fluent are, let's use the phrase dismounted soldiers from the army, right? That are operating without access to resupply and all of that, and without GPS. How fluent are they in AI prompts to use individual tokens smartly, right? What type of availability do they have to retrain a model on data that they didn't have access to 24 hours ago? And maybe it's not fully retraining, but ingesting it and using it to their best advantage. And and yes, a lot of the times it could be off comms that they need deployable systems, right? That's with them. But then when they do get comms back, how quickly and rapidly can they resupply in a way that they have new data, updated information, and all of that ready to go, and a whole new set of tokens?
Or Jen, one step further, do you do reach back for tokens back to a data center back at your home base, or somewhere at a stateside AI factory, or do you need to deploy with a set of racks, and GPUs and a power source deploy forward, so you actually have right at that tactical edge the compute and the AI you need to ingest all that new information coming in from sensors, so you're not running it back through a data center somewhere else. You're actually using it near zero latency, real time, uninterruptible, because you've deployed forward with that AI manufacturing capability. We're
Yeah,
deploying
they're
forward
doing
with
this
three.
for
We're
they're
deploying
doing
forward with 3D printing. We're deploying forward with the things we need to do sometimes at the edge to make things. We need to be doing the same thing with AI. Deploy forward with a table of allowances that allows us to generate new AI for those weapon systems at the very edge. That's the kind of readiness I think that Hertz and I have been talking about. Sorry, Hertz, go ahead.
No, let me throw in there. So the listeners hopefully are familiar with General Al Gray, Marine Corps. He was former commandant of the Marine Corps. He's just a hero of mine. Absolutely love General Gray. One of the things General Gray did better than the Air Force is he adopted the Air Force Colonel John Boyd's OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. And so if you want to really make that case on the battlefield, and taking all the way back to Boyd, all the way back to Sun Tzu, and General Gray said this better than anybody, is you want that soldier, that sailor, airman, marine, guardian on the front line to be able to have a tighter decision loop then their adversary. Whatever it is they're doing, whether they're flying drones, whether they're resupplying, refueling, driving a ship, undersea, on orbit, you want them to be able to have decision advantage. And that's absolutely gets back to General Gray and Boyd Duda Loop. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, it's okay. I mean, we're all talking the same language, I mean, we're at the point where we're in the last 3 minutes of a four-part webinar series. I think we want to leave with, okay, what is the way forward in a way that's tangible? And then really, how do we then move the Department of War? Now, I think we're in a better position on the outside to maybe write than you are on the inside, but hopefully you'll get there at some point. But is how do we ultimately drive the Department of War to start looking at this in a way that we believe ultimately is going to be better for the warfighter. You brought up in the pre-session, General Vaughn, sometimes those digital warriors that know AI are having to step outside their skiff or step outside their office, go down to their car and actually start using tokens that they've got personally because they've run out of tokens, in the workplace. Look, I grew up on the Senate Armed Services Committee with stories about soldiers that were buying their own body armor and buying their own, equipment because they just didn't want to deal with just what the military would provide them. We can't get there with AI. We actually have to figure out that warrior needs all the AI they can use and all the tokens they can manage without having to worry about running out at a critical time.
Yeah, and Ron said this earlier. He quoted NVIDIA, Jensen Huang, and he'll hire a new engineer for $500K a year right out of college. And if that engineer isn't spending $250K worth of compute every year, he's not really sure he made the right investment in that kid, right? So if you think about where our soldiers are compared to that model, we've got a little ways to go.
Yeah. Hey, Ron, we're going to go around for last words because we're coming up on the end of the top of the hour. I would just like to open it up to you for any last comments.
Supply chain resilience. I've been in supply chain for over 30 years. I used to go to dinner parties and see people say, "What do you do? Supply chain?" Nobody even know what the hell I was talking about. I would have to say the most important thing that's happened in the last 5 years since COVID is it's now at least, the 12-step program from AA. Step one is admitting that you're an alcoholic. I'm actually happy that now we're at least having national level conversations on supply chain resilience. There's a long way to go, but at least we've now got the battleship turned and people are now starting to have the national conversation. Every single government entity is involved with it. People are talking about it. I don't think it's as much of a push as it used to be. 20 years ago, nobody cared about it, because nobody understood it. But now people do understand it. So I think we've at least made the first move, which is getting people's mind around the fact that supply chain resilience is economic and national security. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done with a lot of smart people like we've got on this call. But at least we've made some good progress on getting the national awareness moving forward.
Yep. General Vaughn, any last comments?
Yeah, I said that if we go forward and starting now, but especially whatever that next peer-on-peer fight may be, and this will be a part of deterrence. The ultimate metric of warfighter readiness is no longer just bullets in the magazine. It's the amount of resilient compute that we have access to through the supply chain. Every piece of equipment we use and all of the components of that equipment are now information bearing. And so we need to have access to that compute throughout physical as well as intellectual.
Yeah. And I'll end that when I talk about supply chain, and that has been the theme of all four webinars, we have to look at the supply chain from what Ron brought up, the mining, the extraction, all the way to the delivery of an effect by the warfighter to an adversary. So that we have to open up when we talk supply chain. How do we, and particularly in the AI area, what do we do to secure it from extraction of materials all the way to that effect? How that warrior on the battlefield uses it for a computer and a drone and a robot. We have to secure that entire supply chain. And that's what I want to continue to work on with the Potomac Institute. That is it. Jen,
I
I'll
want
turn it
to
over
thank
to you for any last
everyone.
comments. I think we
Yeah,
all have some
absolutely.
writing to do for you, but just wanted to turn over to you for any last things you want to say.
Yeah, all speakers and those of you that are joining us from previous sessions, they're not off the hook. They are now going to be asked to write and help us advance this conversation forward. Thank you all for joining us. And I am going to wrap up on a Grayism, General Gray's quotes. And it's that you cannot write a recipe for all situations, right? So as you're looking at where do we invest all of these things? What's a better use of our time? Not saying that when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority, but if you can't just dictate one solution, right? So we're going to have to look across and identify multiple possibilities. Thank you all again, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Lucian. Thanks, Jen. Nice to meet you, General.